And now we cross over to our Ocean for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Fears are growing over an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine, with Western governments warning that Moscow could mount a major military assault at any time. According to US officials, over 130,000 Russian troops now are positioned outside Ukraine, with weeks of diplomacy obviously having failed to defuse the situation. Is war inevitable, or can it be prevented? We discussed the latest developments with Christopher Hartwell, head of the International Management Institute and professor of international business policy at ZHAW School of Management and Law, and professor at Kozminski University in Warsaw. Welcome back, Professor Hartwell. It's lovely to see you today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, Professor, it looks like tension is just escalating non-stop, and Western governments have been warning that there could be a Russian invasion any day, with earlier reports from the US claiming that it could be as early as Wednesday. Their nationals are being told to leave Ukraine as soon as possible. How dire is the situation right now?
Well, we're at a point right now where Russia is logistically equipped to invade. It's whether or not they actually have the will, whether or not Vladimir Putin has finally decided to take the step that they're going to go into Ukraine. You know, the mood in Kiev and elsewhere in the country is calm, but more like grace under pressure, because this can actually happen. You know, there's been a lot of skeptics that said Putin isn't this crazy, he would never do anything like this. But the continued buildup is kind of reminiscent of World War I. You know, you do not mobilize your army, you do not move your army, so much of your army, and expose other flanks unless you plan to use it. And the longer that you keep troops on kind of the front lines, the more chances that there are that there's going to be an error, that there's going to be some form of perceived provocation, and that there is going to be a shooting war. So it's not dire, but it's not where we want to be in the world right now.
Well, the UK, the US, and other European countries have been sending defensive weapons so far to the Ukrainians. But to what extent would they actually defend them if Russia does invade?
In terms of the weaponry, or in terms of the UK, the US, NATO?
NATO, and sending troops and really helping them.
Well, we're not going to get a hot war between NATO and Russia. We're not blundering into World War III, despite what I just said about World War I. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And in fact, Ukraine probably had no chance of being a member of NATO up until 2014, when it was first invaded by Russia. And that's the only thing that's really kind of pushed the Ukrainian populace together and made them want to do something which they did not want to do before. They wanted to be this kind of neutral country in between West and East, be a friend to both, and just be this kind of conduit for both the European Union and for Russia. But Russia has forced their hand, and now they want to be in NATO. But realistically, in terms of defense, we see right now what is happening is that you've kind of created a cordon sanitaire at the eastern edge of NATO, which would be Poland. This is why the US are sending troops there. This is why the UK are sending troops there, maybe bolstering a little bit of the defensive capabilities of the Baltic states, although they are much more difficult to defend. Basically, we want to say to Russia, if they do invade, that they do not go any further, and probably not even into Western Ukraine. That's what the show of troops are, because, I mean, really 2,000 troops here, 45 troops there, isn't going to stop a full-on Russian invasion. But it's to say that this is NATO's border, and you shall not pass.
And what shape are Ukrainian forces in right now compared to the Russian military?
They are much, much better equipped. They are much more cohesive. They are a better equipped and trained fighting unit than they have been at any time since Ukraine's independence at the end of 1991. And again, that has been forced upon them by Russia's invasion. They understand the lessons of what happened in Crimea, of kind of not resisting. They understand the lessons of resisting in Donbass, kind of the legendary cyborgs who defended Donetsk airport for over 100 days back in 2014, 2015. So, and it's become a much more professional military outfit. That being said, in terms just of numbers, Russia could overwhelm the Ukrainian troops, but the Ukraine could put up an incredibly boisterous fight. It depends, however, on kind of what the goals of the Russian military are. If they're going to have a large-scale land invasion, which we planned for back in the 1980s of tanks streaming through the Fulda Gap, or if they're going to do something much more targeted, if they're going to do something that has a lot more hybrid components, such as electromagnetic pulses, decapitation strikes, things like that. So it's very difficult for Ukraine to be able to handle all of the weapons that are in Russia's arsenal.
Well, for now, the Ukrainian president seems to be trying to keep the mood light. And, well, Volodymyr Zelensky's criticized the panic that the West has been stirring. He says that could, the panic that would ensue from these claims. And he said that he saw no such proof that Russia was planning an invasion in the coming days. What's the difference for his difference in position from the West? I mean, what do you think his game plan really is?
Well, the first thing is that he is a comedian. So in times of stress, he wants to rely on humor, and he wants to kind of draw on, even if it's dark humor, because he is Slavic as well. But you see it from his point of view. His country is now being squeezed. Russia doesn't have any additional sanctions on it because of what it's done, but Ukraine does. Ukraine is seeing Western airlines cancel flights to Kiev because insurers won't take on the risk that comes with kind of the geopolitical situation. You see that the currency, the hryvnia, is being affected. You see that there is a possibility with kind of the naval exercises in the Sea of Azov that there's going to be a blockade. So there's real worries about economic collapse in Ukraine, but collapse isn't the right word, but there's worries about severe economic duress that Ukraine is going to be under. And if Zelensky can kind of present this face to the world, kind of to assuage investors, to assuage international markets, to assuage capital markets, then perhaps they can kind of stave off Putin actually having a victory without firing a shot. If he can just kind of tighten the noose around Ukraine's economy and have Ukraine collapse that way, then Putin wins. So Zelensky's really working to try and counteract that and present this kind of good face that Ukraine is still open for business.
And well, Ukraine's ambassador to the UK said that Kiev might retract his bid for NATO membership to avoid war, but he later did a U-turn on his comments. He said that Ukraine was ready for many concessions in its negotiations with Moscow, but that it has nothing to do with NATO. How are you reading this?
Well, he was probably just speaking off the cuff. He definitely wasn't speaking in terms of kind of official capacity, the official line coming out of Kiev to say that, NATO membership is something that we're willing to give up. He doesn't have the authority to say that. That's something that is coming out of Kiev. In terms of concessions, I'm not really sure what Kiev can make because Russia's demands have been so unreasonable, such as closing NATO's open door policy and saying that they have a veto on who gets into NATO and who doesn't. It can't be something to do with the eastern regions, the Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk, that they're going to be absorbed into this neo-Russian empire, because that's a political non-starter across the political spectrum. So I don't know what the concessions they actually have in mind are, but they don't, even if they are having this consideration of this broad panoply of concessions, they don't match up with what Russia has demanded. And they can't, because Russia's demands are so unreasonable as to be ludicrous.
Now, would you say that it would be convenient for Western governments if Ukraine does drop its NATO bids?
It would be convenient, but there's empirical evidence that it doesn't matter. Ukraine was a neutral nation in 2014 when Crimea was grabbed by Russia, when Luhansk and Donetsk were invaded by Russia. So it doesn't seem that there's in Einstein's phraseology, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the same result. Going back to neutrality, how would that actually aid the Ukrainian people? It would be nice from kind of the Washington, D.C., or especially from Berlin, if the Ukrainians said, we don't want to be part of NATO, and then that gave kind of D.C. and Berlin a cloak to kind of step away. But in reality, it's not going to solve anything. This isn't about NATO, and that's exactly where the Ukrainians are right. It's not about NATO. It's about Ukraine's right to exist and to be a sovereign nation.
And well, if Vladimir Putin does decide to give the order to invade Ukraine, then what would Kiev's response be?
Well, again, it depends on kind of the modalities. If it is the tanks rushing across, if it is limited strikes, if it is trying to kind of cripple infrastructure, if it is trying to install a pro-Russian regime, or if it's just kind of consolidation of the eastern part of the country. You know, there were worries in 2014 and 2015 that there was trying to kind of make the land bridge to Crimea. So maybe that's what's in Putin's mind. Maybe it's kind of getting this land bridge not only to Crimea, but also to Transnistria in Moldova, another breakaway region, which is only broken away because of the permanent stationing of Russian troops. In any event, it's going to be bloody. You know, Ukrainians have been training, they have been ready for this, they understand that this is their homeland, that there's no retreat. And it was mentioned in kind of the lead in to hear about refugees. The issue is that a lot of refugees in Ukraine would have to go to Russia because that's where their families are. They're not only going to the West. So why would you go to the aggressor? Why would you retreat there? That is your home. That is where you're going to make a stand. Ukraine probably and unfortunately will lose any battle with Russia if it comes to a hot war, but they can increase the transaction costs for Russia to make it not worth it.
Well, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he's speaking with Ukrainian, Russian officials this week, and well, Berlin's refusal to supply defensive weapons and take a more explicit line on sanctions against Russia has drawn the German Chancellor a lot of criticism. And well, while he is doing his best in diplomacy, how much power do you think he has in terms of influencing or persuading the Kremlin?
Not much, because the German left and the SPD party especially has a big Russia problem. I mean, you see kind of Gerhard Schroeder sitting on the board of Gazprom now, and it has been a Russophile, a Putin-phile for as long as we can remember. Same thing with Scholz, same thing with many members of the cabinet right now, the SPD-led cabinet in the German government. There isn't really, they're seen as useful from Moscow's point of view. They're not seen as actually having any sway. Fellow travelers in kind of the old communist parlance, it's not that Scholz is going to be able to convince Putin to back down. There aren't any levers. If anything, Germany needs Russia more because it's continued its reliance on energy. It's continued its reliance on Russian gas. And because it didn't do anything about Nord Stream 2. German businesses are against any kind of additional sanctions, and Scholz knows that. So the leverage is all on Putin's side. Unfortunately, it is not coming from the German side at all.
Well, in the meantime, US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, they agreed in a phone call that a diplomatic solution might still be possible. And while previous agreements have failed, as we all saw, but well, what kind of solution do you think they're thinking about, and what would it entail?
The worry is that, again, you get this kind of concert of great powers, this great power solution. And Russia, once again, feels that it is a great power. It's rattling its sabers. It should be respected as a great power. And you end up with the US and the UK going over the heads of the Ukrainians to either do something like take NATO off the table or to cede control of Donbass to Russia and say, okay, you have a legitimate national interest there, Russian speakers and so forth, even though that's a lot of, it's not a real reason to invade kind of another sovereign country. So the worry is though that they're going to go over the head of Zelensky, that they're going to cut a deal, peace in our time, and say, if we just give Putin this, if we give him this, if we have some other security guarantees, then perhaps we can de-escalate the situation. Other than that, I think we've gone the other way. The Biden administration has been screaming bloody murder for the past 2 weeks and saying it's an attack is imminent. Either they have fantastic intelligence and they're trying to call Putin's bluff, or they're really scared. And when people are scared of something happening, especially if they feel it's going to harm the poll numbers, which are already abysmal, then you look for really, really bad concessions.
Well, it was a privilege speaking with you again, Professor. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.